Hello, it's Adam from the Tudor Chest here. In addition to running the Tudor Chest, I am also the co-director of Simply Tudor Tours, a historic tour company which I run alongside my colleague Sarah Morris, known to many of you as the Tudor Travel Guide. Our first 2025 tour is now live for bookings. Titled Anne and Elizabeth, Mother, Daughter, Traitors, Queens, this incredible 8-day-long experience will take in many of the most significant historic sites in England, from Hampton Court Palace to Hatfield House, the Tower of London to Hever Castle, featuring historians including Professor Simon Thurley, CBE, Dr Elizabeth Norton and Illyri Lynn. Later this month, our July 2025 tour is also launching and will be quite unlike any other tour that we're hosting. Titled 1502, the year that shook the Tudor throne, on progress with Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, this tour will take us out of the traditional heartland of London and the South East into the stunning English Cotswolds and South Wales, visiting sites including Raglan Castle, Berkeley Castle, and featuring a 2-night stay at the breathtaking Thornbury Castle. To discover more on this and secure your place on our live tours, or to sign up to latest updates, just head to simplytudortours.com. Dr Charlotte Bolland is Senior Curator of Research and 16th Century Collections at the National Portrait Gallery. She is responsible for the acquisition, research and interpretation of portraits dating from the 16th century, with coordination of research activity within the curatorial department. Today, she joins me for a discussion all about the remarkable new exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery, which Charlotte organised and curated. Featuring an incredible array of portraits and artefacts, many of which I had never seen before, Charlotte has brought together a cohesive and fascinating tale which tells the story of the 6 wives of Henry VIII, both in literal terms and in the way that society has shaped their individual iconography. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 49, 6 Lives, the story of Henry VIII's Queens, with Dr Charlotte Bolland. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast, Charlotte Bolland. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Very welcome. So we're here today to talk about a really exciting exhibition that's currently on at the National Portrait Gallery, 6 Lives. But before we get into that, just a few get-to-know-you questions for those who may not know you. So can you just provide me with a short intro into your background, so where you grew up and what you now do full-time?
So I grew up in London and I studied at Durham University. I did a history degree and then I did a master's in history of art at the Courtauld Institute of London. And then I did a collaborative PhD at Queen Mary and with the Royal Collection on Italian material culture at the Tudor Court. So I've had a bit of time. And I now work at the National Portrait Gallery as a senior curator for the 16th century collections and research. So I look after everything up to 1603. We're very sort of dynastic and chronological. So the death of Elizabeth I, I pass on the baton to my colleague, the 17th century collections curator.
You tap out once you hit the Stuarts, essentially.
Exactly. Nothing interesting happens after then.
No, nothing at all. Durham's a beautiful place to go to university. It's a really good university, isn't it? It's a gorgeous city.
Yeah, really beautiful, like very much immersed in history. And it was a lovely course because you got to pick different modules. So everyone sort of did a make your own degree. So there were people who I did my degree with who I never met because they were doing a sort of Russian history sort of strand or, kind of American history. And I ended up doing very much a kind of Renaissance and kind of art adjacent projects, which is really great.
Nice. So can you remember, was there a sort of specific moment that sparked your passion for, I suppose, specifically Tudor art and Tudor art history?
Well, I think yes, kind of different encounters because they're so familiar to us. There's such a sort of backdrop to our life. I can remember I wasn't too scarred by being presented by a portrait of Henry VIII at an interview, something that I didn't get, but having a moment of having to decode Henry VIII, so obviously, returning to work out to give the final word on that portrait. But I think it's possibly the full-length portrait of Catherine Parr that probably caught my eye as young Tudor enthusiast, mainly because of the beautiful dress and clothing and the sort of jewels. And so it's that wonderful feeling when you go to the National Portrait Gallery that you're sort of among familiar faces and all these incredibly charismatic images that we've come across from history books. The history books are brought to life in the space.
Yeah, I mean, that portrait is remarkable, isn't it? Because I could be wrong, but I think it is the only contemporary full-length of one of Henry VIII's wives still in existence. I mean, there's obviously the Whitehall mural where you've got Jane Seymour and Henry VIII and then Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, but just a solo of one of the wives in complete full length. I think it's the only one.
Yes, absolutely. I think so too. And the other kind of very famous example is, of course, the Christine of Denmark, the one that got away in the National Gallery.
Had two heads.
Yes, had two heads. And that painting, I think, was also subliminally in my consciousness from an early age because I did art A-level and loved painting portraits. And for some reason had this idea that the background of portraits had to be green. And I had no idea why. I was just like, this is the aesthetic of portraits. And it was only sort of later on going back to the National Gallery, I was like, maybe it came from there.
Do you have it, if you could sort of pick a single moment from history to just jump in a time travel machine and go back and witness, do you have one?
Gosh, I don't know that I've been so sort of immersed in the stories of the Six Lives. So I think I probably would something from Henry VIII's reign would come first to mind. And I think what might have been extraordinary would have been Anne Boleyn's coronation and the sort of ceremonies of that, and where wanting to be able to pick and choose, because I imagine, as with all these kinds of big pageantry state events, it would have seemed perhaps fairly impenetrable and mystifying and even dull in places, but being able to pick and choose to see London at kind of peak show-off moment, the kind of arch designed by Holbein, so all the kind of merchants' marches, all the cloth of gold, and this idea of a whole state ceremonial occasion organised around this kind of one extraordinary woman, I think would be fascinating to be able to dip in and out of with a handy crib sheet, maybe with Holbein as a guide. That would be handy.
My answer would be exactly the same. The coronation of Anne Boleyn, no doubt about it. Because to your point, I think it would just be the most spectacular thing to see. And I would also love to be in a position where you're in the audience in Westminster Abbey and you're looking around going, oh, that's Charles Brandon. I recognise him from his portrait. That's Thomas Cromwell. I would love that moment to be able to look around the audience, because we just see them as portraits now, really. But back then they were colleagues. They were, so I think it'd be fascinating from that angle as well to just look about and see who you could recognise from the portraits that we have now, if that makes sense.
And read the who's sitting where, who's on the up, who's on the way down.
Yes, what's the protocol? What's the seating plan set up? So the main purpose of today is to talk about the remarkable new exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery, Six Lives, The Stories of Henry VIII's Queens, which you've been massively instrumental in. So firstly, for anyone who's yet to make it to the exhibition, can you just explain the concept and what inspired you to tell the story of the six wives of Henry VIII in this particular style?
Well, so it's the kind of taking advantage of an opportunity, a new opportunity at the Portrait Gallery, which is that we have a wonderful new exhibition space that's much larger than our previous spaces following our big transformation project when we reopened last year. And so now for the kind of first time, being able to put on a show that really gives the full breadth of the women's lives, and also thinking about their impact on popular culture and the way in which they're remembered. So really having the space to do justice to their stories was so exciting. And so this exhibition spans 500 years. So starting from kind of the present day, where we are now in our understanding of the Queens, and taking you back to encounter them as individuals in the 16th century context through their books, their portraits, their letters and other items of material culture. And then perhaps to kind of come back and review the way that you've been thinking about them, and to unpick a bit of where do these stories come from? How do we understand history? What are the different strands that feed in? And it's an incredibly diverse exhibition in terms of the mix of material culture. So we've not only got portraits in oil on panel, miniatures, medals, but also metalwork, tapestry, cloth of gold, and then coming into the kind of contemporary with costume designs, film, and stamps and commemorative mugs. So there's a whole kind of range of media, because these women have proved so fascinating that people keep on returning to them and want to keep this conversation going.
Yeah, in many ways, it's sort of, the exhibition is the iconography of what the Six Wives are and mean to us, but also to them as individuals. I think that's the sort of the dual. When I went and walked through it, that's what struck me, was this is very much about us, about you trying to teach people about the Six Wives, but also honouring and exploring the iconography around them as people and characters, I suppose.
Yeah, that's a really great way of putting it, and thinking about, I love the kind of thread of performance, because they're so familiar to us now from kind of stage and screen and so many different kinds of productions. But that idea of performance, that they too were sort of performers on the court stage, and they were also very adept at using stories to shape their narratives and to really think about the way in which they constructed their stories sort of in real time.
I loved the fact that at the very start of the exhibition, you have these very striking black and white photographs taken by Hiroshi Sugimoto of the Madame Tussauds waxworks of the six queens of Henry VIII. So why did you decide to open with that? How did you land on that being the first thing that people would see?
Well, yes, I was so excited when I kind of learnt about those images and sort of first saw them in person, because they're incredibly charismatic images, and they're sort of large scale, and even more so when you sort of get into play the sort of staging of them in an exhibition, so sort of dark walls and dramatic light levels. And what I really loved about them was their sort of uncanny quality, which I think really speaks to this idea that we think of the queens as being so recognizable, but actually there is this kind of unreality to that a lot of it is a sort of constructed reality that we're all sort of sharing when we think about the queens, and that sort of playfulness between fact and fiction I really love with those images. And they're also so kind of powerful to think about. What's that sort of opening moment of a show to sort of set the stall out for thinking about some of the ideas and threads of the exhibition? I thought they would do a wonderful job. So they were very much high up on my loan request list at the beginning of the exhibition planning.
In a weird, I mean, I've seen the actual waxworks in person a few times, and weirdly, I think the photographs taken by Hiroshi are somehow more striking than the actual waxworks, because I don't know, they because they look like photos of real people, I suppose.
Yeah, it's amazing the kind of layering of and the power of what happens in our minds when we look at a portrait, that how much kind of we animate them in our minds. And so whereas I think in encountering the waxworks, there's that first sort of uncanny moment that your brain knows what they are, that when looking at these photographs, we just so want to see them as people, and then we have enough kind of information in our head that we can sort of think of their biography as we're looking at them as individuals. So their stories do come to life. And I also like the sort of parallels this has back to the way portraiture functions in the 16th century. And so the photographs are juxtaposed in the opening with the full-length portrait of Henry VIII that's so famous, kind of from Holbein's workshop, which was praised in its own time, Holbein's image of Henry, as being so lifelike that it gives you a fright, because it seems as if it is alive. And so that idea of encountering an image, you think you've just met the person, is something that Holbein was playing with. And so I love having that kind of connection across art history to Sugimoto's photographs as well.
How long was the planning process behind this exhibition? You know, how long did it take to piece it together? And also, how did you track down some of the items on display? Because what's amazing about this exhibition is there's a lot of artefacts in there as well. So how did you sort of piece these together?
Well, so yes, as you're quite right. So it is a long process. And so there's that moment of kind of coming up with the exhibition, of thinking and proposing it internally, of kind of, is this a project that could work? And kind of how would it fill the space? You know, what sort of approach might it take? What's the rationale for it? And then, so that was sort of being thought about in about late 2018, 2019. I was looking at some of my kind of first sort of PowerPoint presentations, thinking things through. And then moving through, I think it was in about 2021 that we had the first sort of go ahead of like, this will be summer 24, right? And that's when an amazing team sort of springs into action of the kind of exhibition team, who are the sort of producers who make a project happen, who deliver it. And so thinking about all that kind of research and the loan requests. And so in terms of finding objects, that it's a wonderful sort of collaborative process, because there are the large kind of institutional collections and who've been incredibly generous. So places like the Victoria and Albert Museum and the British Museum, the British Library, and of course the Royal Collection Trust. And then often in reaching out to curators in those institutions, they know the things that sort of aren't on display. Like, oh yes, actually there's this other work that, you know, I haven't been able to have on display or been thinking about, or and so that kind of colleagues are invaluable support in helping to find things. And then also in looking at previous exhibitions and previous biographies, and because these women are so sort of well studied, and so the sort of scattered crumbs of their surviving objects, the references to them are kind of throughout all these various books and things. So it's piecing those together and thinking about what's the story that we can tell at the portrait gallery, what's something specific that an exhibition can do. And there's also that query when you're sort of selecting works, is thinking about what is sort of powerful enough to speak on its own terms, because that moment, particularly with manuscripts, that, you know, kind of some of the incredibly interesting manuscripts, but are entirely impenetrable handwriting, or very sort of badly damaged from kind of fire or water, and you're thinking, oh gosh, how comprehensible is this? So it's, yes, finding the way to think through objects, which is always so much fun.
I mean, so essentially then, from the sort of first nugget of an idea, it took 6 years basically to bring it together.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
That's remarkable. I thought you'd say maybe 2 years, but not.
Well, because there's that the sort of long process of requesting loans from collections, and so all that kind of process to go through, and then to come to your sort of final list, and then work up your the publication and the design process, and as I said, yes, all of the logistics for transport and conservation and condition reports. So that's a standard time frame, I would say.
Okay, nice. Well, I've learned something new. So obviously, you know, it's the National Portrait Gallery. Portraiture plays a huge role in the exhibition, and you have one of the greatest collections of Tudor portraiture in the world. I'm just curious, do you have a personal favourite among all of these remarkable portraits?
Well, that they are, yes, I mean, they're kind of wonderful paintings and so engaging. There's something in the kind of style of Tudor portraiture that's so immediate. But one portrait that I've come to appreciate so much more during the course of this exhibition, that had perhaps been slightly overlooked at the past, and here to credit the work of Emma Louisa Cahill-Maron, and Susanna Lipscomb writes about this in the exhibition publication as well, that she's done a lot of research in this area, of a portrait miniature in the gallery's collection of Catherine of Aragon, which is not in sort of perfect condition, has had sort of bits of intervention, so has perhaps kind of aesthetically been overlooked occasionally. But what Emma and Susanna have kind of rightly pointed out is the fascination with this image, because it has this inscription identifying Catherine as Queen Katharina, Eos Uxor, his wife, and so was clearly intended to be created as a pair to an image of Henry VIII. And the portrait miniatures of Henry VIII are all sort of dated generally to around 1526, 27, because a number of them say that he's in his 35th year. And that's a moment when you don't think necessarily that Henry would be commissioning a paired portrait of him and Catherine. This is the moment where he's trying to say that, you know, the marriage doesn't exist. And so what this image perhaps is a sort of assertion by Catherine of her status as his wife. And Catherine is, you know, such a fascinating figure, because she fully adheres to the conventions of 16th century marriage. You know, she will defer to Henry in all things, except for the fact that she will not deny the fact that their marriage exists. So that kind of assertion of her as a wife, and that what's so interesting is that she, in this portrait, isn't wearing English clothes, with kind of puffed sleeves and a caul, so you can see her hair rather than the big heavy gable hood. And this is something that she sort of deliberately did on certain state occasions, particularly when kind of meeting her nephew Charles V to kind of assert her Spanish heritage and power. And so I think there's something really interesting in perhaps Catherine presenting herself as Henry's wife and as a queen with a sort of heritage and family who could not just be dismissed. She couldn't simply be told to head off to a convent because she had the weight of sort of Charles V and her family supporting her.
Yeah, it's a definite show of strength, isn't it? With portraits, there's obviously a lot of confusion that comes up with the portraits of the six wives, and in particular with Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, because of the way their lives ended. It's well documented that there are, to the best of our knowledge, no portraits of Anne Boleyn still in existence from her time as queen. Portraits can also be misidentified, and we mentioned earlier about that beautiful full length of Catherine Parr that for many years was referred to as Lady Jane Grey. So how do you go about re-identifying a sitter and sort of switching from sort of stepping away and saying, no, that's not Lady Jane Grey, this is actually Catherine Parr? What does that process look like?
Yeah, so this is kind of one of the sort of fascinating pieces of my job, and sort of, in a way, most unusual kind of skills to develop, of sort of recognising people who've been dead for hundreds of years. And so the process is very much kind of building together sort of all the evidence you can from a range of sources, and that with and also always being transparent about that, because particularly for Tudor paintings, we often have sort of three pieces of information. So it's like, on the grounds of this information, this is why we think this. Should a fourth fact turn up, that's going to turn everything on its head, and we'll, kind of review accordingly. And that was what happened with the full-length portrait of Catherine Parr, because it had, in thinking about the identity of the sitter, that always thinking about the sort of broader iconography, and this is a sort of approach the Portrait Gallery has taken for many years, and we have an incredible reference archive of images of British portraits sort of by sitter, which is open to the public Tuesdays to Thursdays. And so, kind of getting to that box down and being like, right, what are all the things that have been called Catherine Parr or Lady Jane Grey? And that in trying to identify this full-length portrait, researchers very understandably, looking at print sources, and found an early 17th century print in which someone who looked, wearing very similar clothes and, clearly derived from this portrait type, was called Lady Jane Grey. So it's like, right, well, if they've, from the early 17th century, they're calling this person Lady Jane Grey, that's a very plausible, kind of long story. But what they hadn't taken into account was the unfortunate thing that for your portrait to be remembered, you need to have that sort of specific kind of 50-year window after you die for someone to really make sure they've taken notes and sort of written all the information they can on the painting. And Catherine Parr, of course, doesn't have that. And so she is sort of very quickly in the Elizabethan period seemingly co-opted into an image of Lady Jane Grey, when suddenly Lady Jane needs to be celebrated as a kind of Protestant heroine, and casting around for an image very pragmatically, sort of Catherine Parr was, her portraits were co-opted, and there was really no one to correct this sort of error that was made. And so then it kind of got built into the history. And so then it was only in, so there are kind of numerous portraits. It's like, oh, they all look like this person, they're wearing these clothes, they must all be Lady Jane Grey. And then it was in the 1990s, Susan James published an article where identifying the jewel that the sitter wear inventory. And it's like, oh yes, this is Catherine Parr. And it makes so much more sense to be Catherine Parr, kind of as things fall in, but because, Lady Jane Grey has such a tiny, tiny window of opportunity as to whether her painting might ever have been painted or not. And whereas Catherine Parr was fascinated by portraiture, and we have records of her commissioning all sorts of images, so there should be lots of images of her. So it is that kind of mix of, in this case, it was one fact, finding that one reference was enough to change perspective on the evidence that we already have, and to kind of unpick an error that had been made centuries ago.
Yeah, and you also have to think about, in some respects, you have to look at it and think logically, that clearly isn't a 16-year-old.
A very fair point. It's very hard to judge, kind of age and things, because often with these things, there's very subjective things that come into play of like, oh, does this person sort of look right age? I think the most extraordinary is the beautiful half-length portrait of Catherine, which was recently sold at auction. It's now in a private collection from the Jersey collection, formerly.
Oh, in the black.
Yes, exactly, in black.
Yeah.
And which has also been called Lady Jane Grey at sort of points in the past. And the sitter clearly looks like she has aged relative to the gallery's half-length portrait. Sort of shows you what, 4 years marriage to Henry VIII can sort of can do to you. And so the idea that she definitely doesn't look 16 in that portrait. Kind of, it's beautiful and charismatic, but in no way a 16-year-old.
Yeah, that portrait is stunning, isn't it? It sold at Sotheby's, didn't it? I think last year. It's a beautiful portrait. I mean, just amazing. Can you talk a bit more about how jewels actually will often really play a big role in helping to identify a portrait of particularly the Six Wives?
Well, so yes, it's really interesting. So there was that kind of one sort of touchstone moment we're thinking about, this sort of jewel with the crown on top of it that identifies portraits of Catherine Parr, and that can be seen in a number of her portraits. That we have a few inventories of the Queen's jewels, and Nicola Tallis, who wrote in the publication, has written extensively about this. And their jewels are so sort of extraordinary, the kind of descriptions of this type of jewels that the Queens wear. And what's really interesting in gathering all their portraits together in this exhibition is you can see the jewels that reappear. And there's always the question of, artistic license. How faithfully is somebody, is this the same jewel that's just being rendered slightly differently, or is it a different version of the same jewel? So that it's kind of hard to identify specific moments, but there's clearly this sort of headless Tau cross that appears in the number of the Queen's portraits. Also the sort of pendant with looks like an emerald and a ruby. So that idea of kind of continuity across the Queens is so interesting. And the person whose jewels have been used to identify their portrait kind of most recently is Catherine Howard. And the sort of contested question of the Holbein miniatures, of which there's one in the Royal Collection and one in the Duke of Buccleuch's collection, which is on display in the exhibition. And the work was done identifying the jewels in that to an inventory of Catherine's jewels, getting quite specific on her kind of partlet and square of, counting diamonds and emeralds. And to an extent that I'm happy to call that sort of probably Catherine Howard. The balance of probability, I would say that is Catherine Howard. But there's always a composite picture bringing in evidence from all sorts of sources.
Well, there's also, a couple of years ago, there was some discussion that it might be Anne of Cleves, wasn't there?
There was indeed. And so as I was saying, that's where this moment of the kind of the subjectivity kind of comes in as to how do you recognize someone after all these years. That I sort of lean towards Catherine Howard in relation to the kind of sitter's hair color. That the fact that there are the two jewels, that the two versions of the miniature. The sitter is, I think, undoubtedly a queen from the level of jewels and the kind of cloth of silver and cloth of gold wearing. So it's a short list of people it can be. But I think that Catherine is a kind of more plausible candidate for having a portrait painted at that moment, particularly in the context perhaps of the progress that was planned to York and the kind of grand celebrations, that all the artisans of court are at work preparing for what is sort of rumoured to perhaps be a coronation, but everyone is making all sorts of work. And one sort of crumb of information that came out during the exhibition research is that I think that Catherine did commission a jewel from Holbein. So that idea of Catherine's direct engagement with Holbein and interest in arts, kind of a further crumb of supporting evidence towards that.
Those little clues are often sort of hiding in plain sight, aren't they? I mean, I don't know whether... So I've got a book coming out at the end of the month about the rise and the fall of the Pole family. And there's, obviously, I'm sure you know that portrait that is long associated with Margaret Pole. Do you know the one I mean?
In white and quite a sort of narrow face with a green background, that one?
Yeah, yes. She's got like an on the gable hood. There appears to be sort of a piece of ermine fur on the gable hood, and then and it's a tiny little detail. One of the reasons why people think it could be her. Well, there's several reasons, but a clue, it's a tiny thing, and once you spot it, it's definitely there. Margaret Pole's father, George, Duke of Clarence, was famously executed by being drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine. And if you look at this portrait, the sitter has a charm bracelet hanging from her right wrist, and the charm hanging from it is a little barrel of wine.
Well, yes. So. A very interesting choice.
One of the other ones I wanted to ask you about is, so there's that Richard Burchett series of, I mean, he actually did more than just the Six Wives, but you've got the Six Wives on display. The one of Anne Boleyn that he did is clearly based on Anne of Bohemia. Like, if you look at the portrait of Anne of Bohemia, he must have
Absolutely.
he must have seen it and thought, oh, that must be Anne Boleyn. But I've always found it really confusing, that one.
So I think this is another example where the kind of misleading sort of power of the print record, because often when were created and copies of portraits, kind of research was done. People were intending to have, very good representations, and sort of lots of researchers saying this is why this is this person, often identifying which collection it is as for sort of broader dissemination. And that portrait had got misidentified again at an early date and then sort of disseminated in prints. So I think possibly Burchett was looking back and going, oh, look, well, here's a 17th, 18th century print identifying it, must be right. And then kind of going off. But actually, it was an error that had been baked in. And of course, there's the challenge of kind of a vacuum offering all sorts of space because of the question about Anne Boleyn's portrait. There wasn't necessarily a rival option to make a stronger case. So it was like, right, need an Anne. This says it's an Anne. Let's go for it.
Yeah, I think that's part of the big trouble as well, isn't it, with Anne Boleyn portraiture, is that really no one portrait looks exactly like the other in the face. The face is always slightly different across the many portraits of Anne Boleyn, be it the most famous one, which is the one in your gallery, but then you've got the Hever Rose, you've got the Nid Hall, you've got the Horrenbout miniature, and the face is always different. And I think that just adds to both the confusion and the mystique, I suppose.
Yes, yeah. I mean, and it's been sort of kind of fascinating. People have given me for centuries, given people lots to talk about, and the challenge is identifying that kind of touchstone work that everyone can agree upon and then say, right, now it does matter if this looks or doesn't look like this. But at the moment, there's still so much flux that it's like, oh, actually, in relation to each other, we don't know which is the one to be the key source.
So one of the things that I adored about this exhibition is the fact that you've got a lot of artefacts on show. And, our Tudor artefacts are notoriously hard to come by. There's not that many. So I'd like to discuss a few, if that's all right. And one of the ones that I was just so struck by is the Howard Grace Cup, which belonged to Catherine of Aragon. So can you just tell me a bit more about it, what it was actually used for, and also the thing that I was most struck by is that at its sort of centre is this elephant ivory bowl that belonged to Thomas Becket. So that's an item that's it's over 850 years old. It's just, what a survivor.
I know, yeah, it's extraordinary object. It's so that we're so excited to be able to borrow it. So it belongs to the Victorian Albert Museum, and because to me it really speaks of that sort of moment of the England that gets kind of completely changed after the moment of the divorce and at the end of Catherine of Aragon's reign, and the sort of erasure of that England in sort of subsequent decades. So there is this cup in it, which is an ivory bowl that Catherine was bequeathed by, and I'm going to get his name wrong, Edward Howard, who was Lord Admiral, who died in conflict with the French early in her reign. And so she was bequeathed this bowl relating to Thomas Becket. And so this idea of, kind of a Spanish queen coming to England, her sort of adopted country, that Becket's shrine is one of the most important in Western Europe. And so, really taking to heart this kind of English saint, and which she then has kind of adapted into this Grace Cup with beautiful metalwork and mounts featuring her pomegranate emblem. So it gets sort of transformed into an extravagant item of material culture. But in that, there's this kind of tragic parallel between what happens to Catherine and what happened to Becket. So Becket is, of course, martyred, professing the rights of the church against the king. Catherine is very much upholding the rights of the church against her husband, and she has her emblems are, of course, erased from court as kind of Anne Boleyn's rise. That the one that she's sort of most hurt by is the changing of the erasure of her emblems from the Queen's barge as part of the preparations for Anne's coronation. So this idea of this sort of deliberate erasure of Catherine, and then, of course, only a few years later, Henry orders the destruction of Becket's tomb. And so he is kind of cleansed from the English story. So this kind of intertwining of these sort of parallels between Beckett and Catherine in this object, I found so powerful. We're so excited to be able to include it in the exhibition. And he's also got kind of the surrounding of the cardinals, the kind of tragic cardinals in the English context of sort of Fisher and Wolsey sort of looking on, and then with also an incredible painting by Sebastiano Piombo of Pope Clement VII, the kind of key pope in the coordination. So very much the Catholic section of the exhibition.
And I think items like this, I think they always also, for me, I think we tend to have this image that people living 500 years ago, 800 years ago, weren't particularly skilled in making real sort of beauty in the way that cup is. But these items show us that they were actually very, very advanced when it came to metalwork and creating masterpieces in this sort of thing. And I think that's always a nice reminder that these people were not as sort of, for want of a better word, backward, you know?
Oh, yes. No, yeah, incredible skills. And that was one piece I was really happy to be able to include as well was a piece of cloth of gold, also known from the Victoria and Albert Museum, because this is a textile that you hear kind of read described in all sorts of inventories, and it's the type of cloth that is restricted to royalty. The most expensive is where it's tissued cloth of gold, and so you have not only the kind of warp and the weft gold wrapped silk threads, but also the pile of the velvet. And this is the kind of fabric that you see in so many of the portraits, and which kind of made the tents at the Field of Cloth of Gold. And to see it in the kind of flesh, the extraordinary kind of skill and the weight and the level of kind of gold within it, and to think that this is what the portraits are trying to convey. And artists go about representing cloth of gold in different kinds of ways. But then if you compare it to, which I have been able to in the past, sort of costumes, and actually you can see even a little bit in, we have some costumes in the exhibition, that the where lighting, the tricks of lighting can perform miracles. So we have the amazing costume designs that the Bloomfields, John and Anne Bloomfield designed for the BBC television production in the 1970s, and which were all, kind of spray painted paper clips and kind of dipping bits of velvet in bleach to try and make textures. And then to encounter actually a piece of cloth of gold, you're like, all right, the expense and lavishness of the Tudor court is quite hard for us to kind of picture, absolutely, I think.
Yeah, and I was always very impressed with the costume design in those earlier 1970s series and films. I think they do a far better job of costume design than we're currently doing with things like the Tudors and, well, Wolf Hall. Based on the images of season 2, they've improved things somewhat. But the 1970s productions had it down. They really knew what they were doing with the costume design.
Yeah, no, they're so happy to be able to include those in the exhibition. That many of the costumes themselves no longer exist because they were, not created for longevity. They had a sort of specific task. But I love the creativity of them. That the Bloomfields worked with making collages out of cutting ups of Sunday supplements, and so you kind of. The skill is evident in the kind of creativity, but they're also something that's sort of quite inspiring. They really want you to go and have a go and make some costume designs. So I would advise anybody to take a close look at them and then, think about their own process.
One of the other items you have on display is the famous Most Happy Medal that was struck in 1534. We think probably when Anne Boleyn was pregnant for a second time. Now, this is the only... Well, to the best of our knowledge, it's the only image of Anne Boleyn still in existence that is undoubtedly struck during her lifetime. And it's damaged, although it's not as badly damaged as people think it is, I believe, based on the work that Lucy Churchill's done with the recreation. But what do you think this medal can actually tell us about Anne's true appearance?
The challenge of what it was, what it originally looked like. And it doesn't, that whilst there are masterpieces of portrait medals kind of in the Renaissance, it doesn't look like this had quite as much sort of source information in it. So how useful it would have been, how useful it even in perfect condition as a comparative across media, because that's always the challenge of when you're trying to make a medal, this is a very different challenge to trying to make a miniature or trying to make a painting, and so it's only certain kinds of examples where I can actually see that as a comparative.
Yeah, it's a very different medium.
Exactly, and with the damage, it's hard, to make decisions about kind of, does this nose match that nose in that portrait, I don't think works. The one thing I think is really useful about that medal is the fact, the choice of the that Anne is identified as AR. And I think this perhaps could help us unpick or raise questions about the most famous type of portrait, including the example at the Portrait Gallery, and the bee jewel, and quite what is happening with the bee jewel. Because I think, as in that medal, Anne as Queen would be calling herself Anna Regina, and that's her identifying kind of letters, or having HA jewels with kind of Henry and Anne, as happens in other sorts of emblems, that to identify herself as a Boleyn, I feel would be a slightly unusual decision to take in the context of her reign, but perhaps may have been something that, from an Elizabethan perspective, is a way of slightly othering her in a way. It's like, yes, her and Henry were definitely married, Elizabeth definitely legitimate, but we can't, how to quite deal with all the questions raised during her execution from an Elizabethan perspective. Can you fully rehabilitate her? Because to do so makes Henry a murderer, so you can't quite do that in the context of Elizabeth being queen. And so if she's a Boleyn, then it just puts a little bit of distance between her kind of and the crown. So I do wonder if that is a bit of posthumous branding rather than necessarily contemporary branding, in part because of the fact this medal is very prominently AR.
Yeah, or maybe it's the other thing to also, I suppose, for us to consider is that, all of the Anne Boleyn portraits with the bee pendant were created after her death, but it's entirely possible someone was working from a lost original painted in Anne's lifetime, but before she was queen, when that bee pendant would have been appropriate, but it wouldn't have been appropriate after her marriage, I suppose, is another possibility.
Exactly, that kind of, and again, as I was saying, that idea about sort of always showing your working. So it's like, on the grounds of these bits of information, that is absolutely a possibility. And, everyone awaits the moment of something to emerge from an attic somewhere or a back of a drawer, because astonishingly, Tudor things can still be discovered.
Of course, absolutely. And I think that one of the other big things about that medal is that it also proves undeniably that Anne wore a gable hood at times, and that's another thing that I've had people say to me before, she only ever wore the French hood, and I'm like, well, no, actually, firstly, she wore a gable hood to her execution, which I think is very telling, but it's also, that medal tells us she undoubtedly wore a gable hood, and if this coin has been struck to mark a very significant moment in her tenure as queen, the fact that she's wearing the gable hood again, I think, is quite telling.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. That is one piece that's clearly visible, kind of undeniable in the medal. So yes, a very useful piece of information that it contains.
I think perhaps the item I was most excited to see was a book dedicated to Catherine Howard. It has her initials on the front of it. I mean, I had no idea this item existed, and so little survives of Catherine's time as queen. So what is the story behind this book? Where did you find it? Do we know if Catherine ever read it? What can you tell us?
Well, yes. So this is a wonderful book from the Wellcome collection, which is sort of, yes, tantalising. So it's dedicated to Catherine, and it is a translation of a German text about childbirth and pregnancy and conception, called Der Rosengarten, that was translated by Richard Jonas from Eucharis Roslin's German original. And as I said, it's dedicated to Queen Catherine. But it might not necessarily give us any insight into Catherine individually, because it was quite probably a translation such as that would, be a long project to kind of organise. And it was probably intended as a gift for Anne of Cleves. You could think, kind of a sort of a German translation for a new German queen, and a sort of hurried substitution of adding Catherine's name in place of Anne's. And then the book is a huge success, and it becomes known as the Women's Book and goes through countless editions, but Catherine is erased from all the subsequent editions. She's only in the 1540 first edition. And so, yes, as a sort of an inadvertent trace of her that survives. And there's also another group of books associated with Catherine that we have one on display in the exhibition, of beautiful bindings with KH, and which James identifying how they must be related to Catherine Howard's time as Queen in relation to the date of publication. But again, these probably don't give us any insight into her as an individual, because they seem to have been part of a job lot to the King's Binder, a kind of group bulk commission, probably for the new library at Nonsuch Palace. And what was amazing in looking at that book in the British Library, because we've displayed it to show the binding, which is so beautiful, but if you do open it up, it's like it's never been read at all in 500 years.
Really?
The pages are incredibly crisp. It is a rather sort of dry treatise that you can imagine sitting on a bookshelf for that crucial sort of few years after Catherine's death, and then eventually being pulled out and not being so contentious, being like, oh, fine, this is to do with Catherine Aragon, to do with Catherine Parr. It doesn't sort of need to be erased because it just quietly laid unread on a bookshelf for a long time.
Yeah. I think, well, another thing about it, though, that's just really, really simple thing, but it probably tells us that she definitely spelt her name with a K, because, you know, that's another thing there's always, you know, the three Catherines, it's always a mixture between CK, CK, CK. This probably gives us a really clear indication that her name was spelt with a K.
Yes, and that in that question of writing about the queens always has this sort of style nightmare of like, help, how am I going to spell their names? I followed the Dictionary of National Biography and went with K, but we have to have in the exhibition, because lots of artworks have been titled with C's, so to kind of enable them to be findable. So there are some C's kind of scattered about, but I think in the letters that we have in the exhibition from Catherine Aragon, Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr are all signed with K's. But then with, a Catherine, a Katharina and a Catherine. So have slightly different spellings.
Well, that's also the Tudors for, because, you know, because there wasn't standardized spelling. It just makes the job for us historians all the more challenging. So perhaps the most famous portrait of Catherine Parr is... It's quite an unusual one, because she's wearing this ruby puffed sleeve dress and a bonnet that's quite unlike anything that we see in any of the other portraits of Henry VIII's wives. Now, obviously, fashions change over time, but I wondered if, and I'm just curious to hear your opinion, whether this was created specifically to almost mirror Henry VIII to mark Catherine's time as regent, because that hat she wears is very similar to the ones we see Henry wearing. Do you think, you know, as a historian of art, do you think there is something in that?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting suggestion, that the challenge with that portrait type, which is the one which was used as the source image for the waxworks in Madame Tussauds, and so is in there in beautiful large scale in the Sugimoto black and white portrait as well, so it kind of reappears in the exhibition, is that it's a later 16th century copy again of a lost portrait. So to find the source image would be fabulous in terms of, you know, if we could pin anything down more on the dating question. But that idea of it being associated with her regency is very, very plausible. And it's interesting as a kind of parallel that how we interpret the so-called Darnley portrait of Elizabeth I, the kind of half length where she's in what is now a sort of cream and kind of rust coloured patterned dress with an incredible fan in the Portrait Gallery's collection. And she has this very much a sort of doublet style gown. And it's often been interpreted as being a deliberately sort of masculine assertion of dress. And so that kind of having that predecessor in Catherine Parr's imagery, I think is a very plausible idea.
I have to admit, with the thing that's always struck me about that portrait as well, though, especially if we compare it to the full length and the one that came up at Sotheby's, where in the black gown, the face is quite different. Where with the other two, you can see the correlation with the other portraits of Catherine Parr. In that one, the fact that it was a later painting, not contemporary, kind of makes sense, because the face is slightly different in a way that the others aren't.
Yes, and so much like you can have in the situation with the variation between the different late 16th century Anne Boleyns, so where you kind of go, oh, you're all clearly starting from a similar place, but you've ended up with, you know, quite different images in a way. So what the relationship to the source images, what kind of slight changes might have crept in that reproduction process, because yes, she does look slightly different.
And there's also features in these portraits as well that, I mean, don't get me wrong, I adore the most famous portrait of Anne Boleyn that is in the National Portrait Gallery, but the features are it doesn't really look like a normal person. If that makes, in the same way that the Hever Rose portrait doesn't look like a real person, in the way that the Holbein sketches do, or the mouths are just too small. You can tell that this wasn't based on someone from life in a weird way.
Yes, and that we have, I mean, that we're sort of as historians and kind of people sort of interested in the period, we are so fortunate in the fact that of all the artists to kind of wash up on England shores, Hans Holbein the Younger was there for that moment, because his style of painting and the kind of scale of these images are so charismatic and instantly engaging that there isn't that sort of sense of a sort of rather impenetrable kind of distance between us as sitter. You feel that you can gauge Thomas More as a man, you can encounter Thomas Cromwell as an individual, and that is through Holbein's perception. And so if you don't have a Holbein sort of source image, we're kind of spoilt by them. So then it's like, oh no, we're further away than we imagined we could be from some of these figures.
I always think about as well what happened with the sort of the early Middle Ages and the House of Plantagenet, where these drawings look like they've been done by a 5-year-old, and suddenly we land into the Tudors and we've got these gorgeous, realistic, genuine portraits. Like, what happened there? There must have been people that had the skills to paint in the era of the Plantagenets, but they just weren't done in the same way.
Yes, there's that moment of kind of what your sort of market and expectations. And so the great artistic influence in England is, of course, the Netherlands and all the sort of trade. And as oil painting is developing in the Netherlands sort of in the 15th century, and then that ability to kind of render portraits in that way. But it seems that the English just weren't sort of so interested in having portraits, and that they were being produced instead for the very practical reasons of dynastic marriages, so sort of sent abroad. So there could well have been, a few earlier ones. That Henry VII actually seems to have been the first to have proactively tried to visually establish his dynasty. So in commissioning a Netherlandish artist to kind of take portraits of the royal family to Scotland, to Spain, to kind of as part of the marriage negotiations. But that's what's so interesting. So at the Portrait Gallery, the earliest painting in our collection is from 1505, portrait of Henry VII, produced as part of marriage negotiations with Margaret of Austria. And you can see that the English really sort of, once they knew about portraiture, they got pretty excited by it. And so, over the course of a century, you then end up with something like the Ditchley portrait of Elizabeth I, where kind of all rules are out of the window, large scale, huge sort of compositional opportunities. So once it had established a footing in England, portraiture was off.
Yeah, and then it became a PR machine.
Yeah. And it seems that there's been that Holbein sort of set an interesting template in that there are sort of moments where one artist kind of grabs the market of the aristocracy and everybody wants to be painted by them. And so there's the sort of Holbein phase, then there's a kind of George Gower phase going on to onwards Van Dyck and kind of onwards through the story of British art history. But there isn't lots of people are keen to have images all seen through the eyes of the same artist, kind of comparative images to their peers, rather than necessarily wanting to be groundbreaking and commission different kinds of approaches.
What, above all, do you hope people come away from this exhibition having learnt?
Well, I suppose above all, I hope that people kind of enjoy visiting the exhibition and enjoy having that kind of wonderful sort of suggestible kind of encounter with history and with meeting individuals and kind of leaning into that, because I definitely find some of these objects so sort of powerful and charismatic, and so offering people that sort of encounter in the sort of broader terms, I think it's really interesting to think about how we construct history, how we construct biographies, and all the different layers and that sort of gap between, the overlay, between fact and fiction, so where the historical imagination sits. And this is a process that I don't want to in any way to kind of get rid of. It's fascinating, it's important, but just for people to be aware that it's in play in all these things, and so can enable stories to go off in all sorts of different directions, but that they are constructed. And then the final thing is also that the way that these queens are remembered for one moment, sort of most popularly for the way in which they were unqueened, the end of their marriages to Henry in the rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. And that, of course, we're all so much more than one event in our lives. And so in the way that the portrait gallery can tell stories, it's a lot about thinking of, kind of empathy. And I think in having empathy for the breadth of these women's stories is something that I hope people go away with, leave with.
Absolutely. So my final question is a what if, really, I suppose. What missing item from Tudor England, be it a portrait or an artefact, would you love most to sort of creep out of the woodworks?
Well, I suppose, yes, we have revisited
I think I know what you're going to say.
Exactly. You know what I'm going to say. And in a way, this would be a thing that would sort of end conversations. So do we really want to find it? But the Holbein kind of portrait of Anne Boleyn, where he's handwritten, I definitely wrote this, and a Holbein painting of him in sort of full compositional magnificence mode. So, pulling out all the stops, portrait of Anne Boleyn, with handy annotations of exactly what everybody was saying and when it happened, why it happened, would be really interesting. But it would, yes, it would start different kinds of conversations, perhaps.
Yeah. In some respects, it might tarnish the mystique. But I'm exactly the same as you. That is the thing I would love to see more than anything is a true portrait of Anne from life. And we'll just have to wait and see what happens. I'm convinced there is one out there, and it's just waiting to be discovered in a loft somewhere. Then someone doesn't know what they're sat on,
or quite possibly it may be sitting somewhere very publicly and just with the wrong name.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know Owen Emerson quite well, and he and I, the Holbein sketch with the double chin, and he is adamant it is Anne Boleyn because of the John Cheek description. I just don't believe it's Anne. I just don't think it's her. But who knows?
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating drawing in that one because it, so much information contained with it of having the identification, but the question the sort of decorum of the image. And that was one thing that I love being able to kind of share with people a bit in the exhibition in the German film from 1920, the Anna Bolena.
Oh yes, the silent one.
Yes, exactly. That the director had clearly seen that portrait and was playing on it in Anne's sort of costume. And I think there's a really interesting play on all the scholarly debates of is it or not her, when she sort of implores Henry saying, I am still queen. And Henry rebukes her with, I know queen humiliates herself so. I think that's very much that idea of some art historians. She is still queen. No queen humiliates herself. So, to be continued.
I had a few weeks ago. I had a student come onto the podcast, a girl called Emma Demarath, and she has done a thesis about this particular sketch.
Oh, fascinating.
And in her opinion, that she concludes that we shouldn't be automatically believing that it is definitely Anne Boleyn for a couple of reasons. And one of the big ones is that it's the only Holbein sketch that has a recto verso on it, and the recto verso, when you look really closely, has the Wyatt coat of arms, I believe. And she also was able to, from doing some real digging, she was able to track down the fact that it's entirely possible that John Cheek never actually met Anne, was her patron, but never actually met her. So who knows?
Conversation continues.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I was really excited to chat to you because this exhibition is so remarkable. So when is it ending? When how long have people got?
So it's on until the 8th of September. And that I would, of course, urge everyone to go, but to make the point that this is an exhibition that can't tour because of all the light sensitivity of a number of the works, all the manuscripts and miniatures. So this is a kind of a one moment.
A one and done. Got it. Okay, amazing. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on to chat, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you so much. It's really enjoyable.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. My thanks to Dr Charlotte Bolland for coming onto the show and discussing the Six Lives exhibition with me. In addition to this, my main episode, I also release a weekly subscriber-only episode via my Patreon or Apple Podcast subscriptions. To access this, just head to patreon.com/The Tudor Chest or search for the podcast in Apple Podcasts. Next week, I'm thrilled to be welcoming Linda Porter onto the show for a discussion all about her latest book and its subject, The Thistle and the Rose, The Extraordinary Life of Margaret Tudor. That'll drop a week today. Thank you again for listening to the show, and speak soon.